If you had asked me a few years ago what my biggest fear was, I would have told you, I'm terrified that one day I will wake up and have lost control of my mind. That I will not be able to distinguish reality from fiction, that I will unconsciously hurt those around me, and that worst of all, that I will look in the mirror and not recognize myself. Now, to a lot of you, those fears may seem unfounded. But to me, it's something that's lingered in the back of my mind since I was a child. You see, my family's like ground zero for mental health disorders. When I was little, we went to visit my grandmother in India. And I remember that when she spoke, she warbled. The conversations never lasted more than 30 seconds. And when they didn't cover more than basic formalities. It was almost as if I was interacting with the ghost of my grandma, a faded version of someone she once was. But what would make me sad was watching my mother's face during these encounters. When her mother struggled to speak, my mom almost imperceptibly shook. Her face drooped. She looked deeply ashamed. After each encounter, she would apologize profusely and say, "Pati, avloda Monday shariale," meaning your grandma, her mind, it just isn't right. I think to a large extent, this shaped her perspective on mental health. My father later told me that my grandmother had had manic depression. I was told that it ran in the family, and at age 13, my dad told me that every day my mother prayed that it had skipped a generation, that it wouldn't affect my sister or us. Too late, I thought. The year prior, I had had my first episode of major depression. But I kept my mouth shut. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. A year later, I came home to my mom crying at the dinner table. My father explained. My cousin had just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Their worst fear had come true. Mental illness had struck our generation. I kept my mouth shut. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. The year after, I grappled with my sexuality. I began to hate myself and went to all methods necessary to rid myself of my bisexual tendencies. My mom called gay people an aberration. I fell in love with one of my friends. I kept my mouth shut. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. In my senior year, I came out as bisexual. I opened my mouth. What they learned hurt them. Sometimes I wish I could take it back. I still remember the months following. Maybe you just haven't been around enough guys. I kept my mouth shut. I think we should try therapy. I kept my mouth shut. As long as your father and I are together, you will never bring a girl into our home. I kept my mouth shut. Lastly, my mother told me not to touch my sister when I hugged her. She looked at me like I was a child molester, and that was my breaking point. But it was also my call to action. It took the loss of somebody I thought would love me unconditionally to force me to apply to scholarships and come to live on campus at ASU. I created a support network of friends who have been there for me through all of my up and downs. I gained a best friend in my father who told me, even if your mother stops being your mom, I will always be here for you. My dad's the kind of person who sends me good morning texts every day with a line of emojis because he hasn't figured out how to use them yet. My nickname for him is Very Chubby Ramesh, and all my friends tell me he looks like Santa Claus. He's the one person that can calm me down despite anything, who always makes me laugh, and who loves me no matter what. So, if there's any lesson to be learned from this, it's this. Sometimes the best parts of yourself can be found during the worst times. If anyone is familiar by the poem Caged Bird by Maya Angelou, here's a little part of it. But a bird that stalks down its narrow cage can seldom see through its bars of rage. Its wings are clipped and its feet are tied, so it opens its throat to sing. Looking back at it, I think in high school I identified a lot with said caged bird, because I was always keeping my mouth shut because I was afraid to offend other people. Although my senior year was by far the hardest experience of my life, it taught me to speak up for what I'm passionate about, to own myself, and to be confident. If you asked me now what my biggest fear was, I would no longer say that it would be losing my mind. Because I now have the resources and support system to help myself in the case that ever does occur. Instead, as cheesy as it may sound, I would say that my biggest fear would be losing this voice that I've found for myself. If I had to give one lesson to my past self, it would be, don't keep your mouth shut, because ignorance never helped anyone. Thank you.